Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Peter Robinson and this is the Ethereum Engineering Group Meetup. So today we've got Raghavendra who's going to tell us about state expiry. So Raghavendra, before you share your slides, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Happy to be here. So I'm Raghavendra Ramesh. I'm a researcher at Consensus Software R&D. At Consensus, I joined Consensus more than 2 years ago now. At Consensus, I've worked on cross-chain technologies, formal verification, and a bit of stateless Ethereum. So before Consensus, I was working on program analysis technologies at Oracle Labs. And my research interests include formal methods, cryptography, now blockchain. Yeah, that's my introduction. I'll go ahead, share my screen. So, okay, hello everyone. So hopefully you all can see my screen. Clarity should be fine. Okay. Yeah, so today I'll be talking about stateless Ethereum and mainly the state expiry, which is one approach inside stateless Ethereum. I must thank Ansgar Dietrich, who is a researcher at Consensus Mesh. I've been continuously talking to him, and he has been educating to me about all this space. He has been researching the space for quite some time now. I'm a newbie into the space anyway. That means I'm in no way an expert. I don't claim to be an expert here, so I'm learning new things in this area. And also, this is a very hot area of research and exploration. So I invite everybody to come to this space and use this talk as a first step to this research space. And I hope with this talk you can know all the things that are required to know to come in and start contributing. So, and feel free to interrupt me during the presentation, it's fine. So that's it. Yeah. So what does the Ethereum horizon look like now? So the merge is in the horizon. That means the execution layer of Ethereum mainnet will be merged with the beacon chain proof of stake. This is expected to happen in Q2 2022, tentatively. So that's the thing. But what's after merge? So there are some things that are planned, which is like a cleanup and stuff. But the next big thing would be the stateless Ethereum. So that's what the community is seeing. So that's what we will see in this talk. Why do we need stateless Ethereum? What exactly is stateless Ethereum or the state expiry approach? And what are the natural questions this stateless Ethereum concept throws? We'll look into this. And we'll also look into the roadmap of, the roadmap or the plan for to implement stateless Ethereum. And we very, very briefly and at a very high level look into the components of the state expiry, which are the Merkle tries and the address space extension. And I'll conclude with summary. So why statelessness? So these are the stats taken 4 months ago, mainly from Vitalik's post that's linked here. So Ethereum state size is growing and it's growing quickly. If you look at this chart, the number of addresses, that is active addresses on Ethereum, is currently at 175 million. And this has never flattened. It's been continuously growing almost linearly. And if you look at the pure state, that's around 35 gigs. And if you look at the Merkle Patricia trie representation of the state, it's 100 gigs. And this is kind of growing approximately 50 gigs each year, almost half this size. So this is worrying. Why? Because it incurs permanent ongoing costs to the network, meaning that the nodes that are participating in the network needs to continuously invest more resources and upgrade their infrastructure uh, to participate in the network. And it is a burden. It's a burden to new nodes as well, because it has to sync the state when it enters the network. So this burden actually creates a wall, an invisible wall for participation. Though wanting to participate in the network, everyone might not be willing to put in more resources. This hinders true decentralization, and which is the promise of Ethereum or most of the blockchain technologies, and hence it's critical. Another thing is, this is a model where anybody is free to create as many accounts on Ethereum, and the participants in the network has to maintain it indefinitely forever. So this is an unsustainable economic model. So the problem is bound to happen someday or later, sooner or later. So this is the problem, the Ethereum state, unbounded Ethereum state growth. So what is statelessness? Statelessness or stateless Ethereum is the answer, or is one of the answers for this problem. The goals of it is to bound the state size. And just to clarify here, the statelessness does not mean the zero state. It means just the bounded state. So this achieves greater decentralization with participation even from resource constrained devices. So these are the goals of statelessness. Yeah, there are multiple paths to realize this goal. One path is weak statelessness. I have color coded it appropriately here. So weak statelessness is kind of more reasons to believe that it will happen. So that's why it's green. This weak statelessness means that the miners or the block producers will keep full state, and others need to store only the state root. Okay, so it's very inclusive in that way. On the other extreme, strong statelessness means that no one is expected to store any state, not even the miners. All the transactions should come with the part of the state it is accessing, as well as the proof that this data, this state data, is not tampered with. So that is strong statelessness. This is largely found out to be not a viable approach anymore. So this is not on the table anymore. That leads to the very prominent approach that we're going to talk about today is state expiry. The basic idea of state expiry is to keep a bounded state and retire the other part of the rest of the state. So that's the fundamental idea. Let's drill down a little bit more onto weak statelessness. As I said, here in weak statelessness, the block producers or miners will store full state. Other nodes are stateless. That means they store only the state root. And it's the responsibility of the block producer to add witnesses to the transactions. They add the witnesses to the block of transactions. The users, largely, they don't have to add witnesses, but they still need to add partial witness. I mean, witness saying that your balance is so much, your nonce is this, because this is checked for the viability of the peer-to-peer network, saying that should I gossip this transaction to the entire network or just not. So this is like an optimization. Users still need to add partial witnesses for their balance and nonces. So the other nodes, let's say the non-block producer or the non-miners, with just having the state root, can still validate the transactions in a block by executing it because the transactions come with the witness, and they can update the state root. So they can sync to the latest state by having the updated state root. but without needing to maintain any state at all. So this is the weak statelessness model. The major problem with this is the current representation of state is in Hexery Merkle Patricia trice. If we create witnesses in this model, it would be too heavy. On an average, it is expected that with Merkle Patricia trice, we will have witnesses of the size of 18 MB per block. So there much research have happened on this problem, and people went through the route of Cartay polynomial commitments, and finally the current approach on the table is Merkle trice, which is planned to be a replacement for Merkle Patricia trice. This would bring down the witness sizes from 18 MB to 120 kilobytes. That's a huge reduction. However, the challenge still remains, and that is what making people to look at other approaches apart from weak statelessness. The main challenge is how do we replace Merkle Patricia trice with Merkle trice? It would be a very complex in-place replacement, so we don't have a very good solution for this yet. So, any questions with respect to the statelessness or the motivation or the weak statelessness approach before we delve into the state expiry?
Hi, Raghavendra. Amit
Yep.
here. I had a quick question about what exactly is state? I mean, what are the contents of an Ethereum blockchain when it comes to state? Is it just the contract data and code, or is it something else?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, maybe I should have included a slide for that. So Ethereum state, no, I think it's very pertinent. So Ethereum state, as I said here, the very first slide. Yeah. So I said here there are so many addresses, right? So each addresses, if you look at Ethereum yellow paper, it comes with a nonce, a balance. Majorly those two for an externally owned addresses. Ethereum addresses are split into two, are categorized into two categories. One is an externally owned address, through which we can only transfer Ether or transfer money, and the other one are the contract accounts. In the EOA, externally owned addresses, you just have two fields, a nonce and a balance. For a contract account, you have a nonce balance, as well as the contract code, that's the EVM bytecode of the contract, as well as the storage. So by Ethereum state, we mean that all this, the states of each of the addresses, that includes the code as well as the storages.
All right, great. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah. So if you look at the block explorers, they will give the size of the current blockchain data. If you look at Ethereum, it is shown to be like 1 terabytes, but that's not what we are talking about. That includes a lot of other things, but we are only talking about the state size, which is like 100 gig in that blockchain data. Okay. So does that clarify, Amit?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Any other questions pertaining to stateless?
Anurag here, just a quick one. Can you talk about the interlinkages between the variables related to the state? So the account linkage to the contract and other variables?
There is no linkage in terms of, there's no overlap in terms of states. The contract can call another function of another contract. That's possible. That's like just a jump in the execution. But storages are exclusive to the accounts. So there are no overlaps.
So is it then right to say accounts form the building block and state transition happens with transaction linkage to the account?
I don't quite follow that question.
So for, accounts are the source from which transactions happen, correct? And
Yeah,
transactions are the one which changes the state.
yes, transactions are the ones that change, or in fact, it's not the individual transaction. You put the transactions into a block. That's the blockchain of the block of the blockchain, and the block means it has a transaction order. And after executing the transactions in that order, that will change the state. So that is the next state.
And when we talk about the storage,
yeah,
in that case, at that point of time with block X, we are storing just the account information. That's it. There's no information related to transaction which links to the state.
So yeah, I think I would suggest to go to the Ethereum yellow paper. That's much more clear.
Yeah.
But very to clarify, we have state, which is the mapping of the accounts or the addresses to their corresponding data, and block, which has the order of transaction or the sequence of transactions. You have one state, and you apply this block or you execute this sequence of transaction, and then you get a resultant state. So blockchain is this sequence of blocks. After each block in this sequence, you have a new state. So that is the state history. And what we are talking now is the, let's say, the latest state of the Ethereum network is of 35 gigs. And what we are saying is that is not manageable. We need to cut out the state size for the nodes to continue to build in the network.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. No. So let's continue with the state expiry approach. So that was weak statelessness. The fundamental idea of state expiry is to split the Ethereum state into time periods. Okay, so in this figure, you have a period 0 root containing the state read and written to during period 0. And then it's period 1. You can visualize period to be a year. Let's say after every year, we transit to a new period. So the thing is, all the transactions that happen will be on the current period. The rest of the periods are frozen or frozen or read-only. I'll just talk a bit more on that. So as I said, the fundamental idea is to split the state into time periods, say 1 year per period, and clients store or need to store the state for only the latest 2 periods. They are not expected to store the states of the earlier periods. No need to store them. But only the latest period is mutable. The rest of the states, the rest of the period states are frozen or read-only. So what does that mean? It means that reads and writes on the states of the latest period happen normally. And we would need, because the nodes are not maintaining the states of the expired periods, transactions accessing the states of the expired states need to come with witnesses. This is the fundamental idea of state expiry. What this gives, or the rationale for this is, it gives bounded state size for a participating node in the network. That means it needs to store the state for only the latest 2 periods. That's a bounded state. It's not an unbounded growing state. So that check. And I also mentioned that it is not an economic sustainable model to have anybody to create as many accounts and impose the burden on the participants of the network to store them for it indefinitely. What this is saying is the burden of the participants will only store the part of the state that is frequently written to or read. So it's kind of prioritizing or giving a convenience for the most active contracts or the most active addresses to have transactions without witnesses. But if you are a cold contract or a cold address, then the transactions should come with a witness. So that is the rationale, bounding the state as well as giving an edge for the hard contracts. Okay. So this naturally raises a lot of questions, actually. So, and we'll look at these questions and we'll discuss the answers for them. Okay, now suppose I am a state expiry client user. I have an externally owned account A. How do I send Ether to user B? It is possible that the user B resides in the latest period. Then it's easy for me. I can do the transaction as I'm doing it today on Ethereum mainnet. What happens if the user B is not in the latest state period, but in the previous period where it is frozen? So I don't require any witness because this previous period state is still maintained by the participants in the network. However, I cannot change it. I cannot add the amount to the user's B's balance because that's frozen. So how do we address this? I'll just list the questions. I'll come to the answers one by one later. Another question is, suppose I want to fire a transaction which executes a function in a contract C. This means, suppose this contract resides in the latest period state, all well and good. If the contract resides in the previous period, then it's well and good because we are not modifying the bytecode. Yeah, another thing that I wish to bring to your attention is, as I said previously while discussing the state, the contract has the account state, which is like the nonce, balance, the code, and the storage. That is the current way of managing the account state. The proposed way going forward is to chunk the bytecodes as well, not to maintain the full bytecode of the contract in the account state, but maintain only a code state root and maintain the EVM bytecode of the contract in a separate trie. So we have a separate trie for the code. We have a separate trie or a key value store for the storage. We have separate key value store for the accounts. So the reason that I mentioned the second point is it is bringing a lot of complexity here. First, I need to check whether the account C itself resides in the current state or not. Second, I need to check if the code to the function resides in the current state period. Another thing is all the storage slots that the execution of the function causes, are they in the current state period or not? So if it is in the if all these are in the current state period, then all well and good. It happens normally as we would do it today. But if it's in the previous period, then what do we do? If it's not in the previous period, but in the expired state, what do we do? The questions get complex here. So let's say we have multiple contracts involved in a transaction. The function on contract C1 is calling the function G on C2. Then we would need to do the same exercise for all the parties involved. C1 account, C2 account, code of F, code of G, storage slots accessed in F, storage slots accessed in G. Okay. Another scenario is where the function F, suppose it's doing a store or a storage or a writing to the storage at slot K. But this slot is not determined statically. I don't know this slot at the time that I'm constructing my transaction. Perhaps this K is depending on the block number. I don't know when my transaction will be included. And only at the time of inclusion of the transaction, I will know the current block number, and that is determined then. So the problem with this scenario is, how do I construct a witness for such a transaction? So you see the natural questions that come with the state expiry approach. So we will see the basic answer that I think will answer some of the questions and we will leave some others, but we'll walk through that. So Consider a scenario that we are either reading or writing to a contract storage from expired periods. Okay. So the transaction sender has to first find the period in which this contract is maintained. So how does he do that? So he look up the current state. Okay. If he's a state expiry client user, then he will have the current period state in the client. So he will look that up and check whether this contract is present in the current period state. That's just a key value storage. He can check that. If it is there, then all will look good. If it is not, then he'll check the previous storage. If not, then go to the previous period, go back to the previous period. That's how he keeps walking backwards until he finds the period in which the contract is stored. Contract account is found. So what does he do then? He needs to construct a membership witness proving that this contract resides in the period N. And he'll also have to prove that this contract does not exist in any of the successive period states. Okay, so that is from N+1 to P-2. All this is guaranteeing is for the block proposer or the miner who will execute the transaction. It's giving a guarantee that you are working on the latest period, the consistent state. So similarly, it's not, as I said, it's not only for the account state. He needs to construct membership and non-membership witnesses for the code chunk that is getting accessed and for all the storage slot that is getting accessed. That's a lot of witnesses. That again makes a case to replace Merkle-Patricia tries with something more efficient, and Merkle tries are found to be more efficient than Merkle. So do people understand this mechanism? This is the fundamental answer to many of the questions raised. And do people have any questions in this?
So because I'm very new to Ethereum, we've got two different data structures. One is a state data structure, and we've got a blockchain data structure involving transactions. And so the state looks to me like a graph type structure, and you're going to partition that graph based on time. And the last two periods of time will be the current state. And if someone proposing a transaction needs to access other resources like transactions and state history from previous periods, it somehow has to work its way back through the state history of periods to work out where that contract or external address is. And then does it somehow bring that into the current state or propose to bring it into the current state of the last two periods before it starts working on it? Is that where we're going?
There is a slight correction there. The thing is, we are not looking at the state history. The state history is little different to the periods of state. State history is defined as you have state 1, you have block 1, and then comes the state 2, which you execute the transaction in the block, then it comes state 2, and then block 2, and then state 3. So this is the chain of states along with the blockchain. So this is the state history which an archive node in Ethereum will maintain. Okay. So but still, if you look at the latest state, there are some parts of the state which are accessed very recently, okay, and some parts of the state which are accessed long ago, okay. I'm not looking at the history of the states. I'm looking at the latest state, one state.
Yep.
The idea of state expiry is to maintain only the state part which is accessed recently, and delete or not maintain the states that are accessed long ago, okay. So that gives a bound or the known cost for a participant in the Ethereum network that, oh, this is the state I need to maintain. Note that all the nodes in Ethereum are not archive nodes. They don't maintain the entire history. Largely, they're called full nodes, which is like you maintain the current state and you maintain the blockchain. Okay, and you update the current state by executing the next block which is coming out of the chain. So for them, it is a relief now because your latest state is bounded. You're not maintaining full state. And the transactions that are coming, which are accessing the parts of the state that you have not maintained, they come with a witness. They come with the part of the state they are accessing. So you still don't have to maintain the expired states.
I know I'm new to this. What actually is a witness in this context? What is a data structure representing a summary of state from previous history?
No. So yeah, thanks for that question. It's very, very relevant actually. So the witness, let's say I have a transaction, and suppose that this transaction is a function call. That means it needs the code of the function to execute. And it also needs the storage slots that this transaction is reading, as well as the storage slots that this transaction is writing. For anybody to validate this transaction, they need all this data. They need the code of the function. They need the read storage slots and the slot indices where the slots are returned to. Okay, so this is the data associated with the transaction. By witness, we mean that this data for this transaction plus a proof saying that the provided data is not tampered with. A cryptographical proof. So this is a witness. Witness is the data plus a proof.
So if we were to think of a function, it'd be like A plus B equals C. So A and B would be the input to the transaction. C would be the output to the transaction. A plus B equals C is the code. And so that's one component. And then someone does a proof that says A plus B, 1 plus 2 equals 3. And they go, okay, yes, that 1 plus 2 does equals 3. And here's a cryptographic proof that the data hasn't changed and that the result was actually what it should be.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, that's correct. If there are any questions, I think I would take that offline, but thanks for this question.
Sorry. Beginner stuff.
Because I have some material to cover mainly. So
okay, thank you.
Thanks, Emil, anyways. So yeah, that was mainly for reading and writing to a contract storage, the common functionality. The writing involves little more additional functionality. One is if you are writing to a contract or if you are updating a contract, you need to bring that account state to the latest period, to the current period. And whatever the storage slots that are updated, that has to be brought to the current period as well. Yeah. So what about new storage slots? Let's say I'm not updating any storage slots. I'm creating a new storage slots. This happens when you do a array append or something like that on contracts. This would typically mean that I need to say that this storage slot did not exist in any of the periods. That means that I need to create non-membership witnesses for every period of state. There is, however, an alternative way to tackle this problem of large number of witnesses is to create a child contract at this time using the EVM opcode, let's say create or create2, and have the new things stored in that account. The benefit with this is, since this account, the child contract account resides in the latest period, we don't need to construct any witnesses. Okay, so that's mainly one way. So we saw how to read and write to contract storage from expired periods. This is analogous for, or this includes the contract code, as well as this includes the case of externally owned accounts. This is not only for the contract storage. So what do we do with the dynamic nature of data? I did hint on that question. As I said, suppose storage slot accessed is determined by the block number in which this transaction is included. Then the transaction sender prepares a witness expecting a certain block number but this transaction gets included in some other block number, then the witness validation fails and the whole transaction fails. This is not only related to the storage slot, it can relate to the dynamic code chunks. You can have a control flow in the contract where it says you either call function F or a function G, depending on a condition. That means that we need to either load the code of F or the load of code of G, depending on a condition, which is dynamic. It could be accounts as well. I can call a contract A or a contract B, depending on a condition. So it is still dynamic. What I'm we don't have, there is no, as far as I know, there is no solution for this problem yet. What people believe or think is that such things are rare. Such a dynamic nature of accessing things are rare, and it's okay to live with occasional transaction failures of this kind. However, that still opens perhaps a minute possibility of a front-running beefing attack. Let's say I'm firing a transaction, and somebody knows that I'm firing this transaction with a specific, which accesses a specific storage slot, which depends on a block number or some external data. They could change that data and make my transaction fail repeatedly. So that's the possibility of front-running beefing attack that I think of. Okay. So as I said, witness validation here means a lot of things. You will have to validate the code chunk, storage slots, account for a function, for a nested function, for a nested function storage slot. So what do we do if one of these fails? Do we still continue for the outer function or not? The current thought is to do a full transaction failure. I don't think anything else can be done here, but I thought I'll just mention this. So that's the state expiry on how to access state and how to access the how to file transactions that belong to the or that access the expired states. Now the central question is, who will provide state? In order for me to create witness, somebody has to provide me a state because I'm not storing it. So we can hope that Ethereum Foundation or hope to have Infura or certain block explorers to completely store the state, and they provide me the state with a proof, with a witness. There is also an effort to have a decentralized solution that's called Portal Network. This is not directly related to the stateless Ethereum effort. It's all orthogonal. It's kind of built, being built as an alternative or a smarter version of Dev P2P, but it does complement statelessness. The Portal Network enables lightweight protocol access for resource-constrained devices. It has different networks for state history, for accessing state history, providing state history, headers, parts of the state, canonical indices, transaction, to process the transaction to the mempool, etc. So they are all independent of each other, which kind of separates concerns and allows a client to, or allows a node in this Portal network to choose which subset of services it needs to provide or to consume. The specification work is ongoing. This is an interesting piece of network work. I invite people for working on this. So what's the proposed roadmap for statelessness? So its plan is to do it in 3 steps. The first step is period 1 hard fork. What do we do here? We do a hard fork and we freeze the state that is hitherto maintained, that is maintained in a Hexary Merkle Patricia trie. From here on, we use Merkle tries in place of Merkle Patricia tries, and that's called the period 1. There is no state expiry here yet. Step 2 is address space extension. Because the addresses now need to be aware of the periods in which they were created or deployed, and the plan is to extend the address space from 20 bytes, which is the current Ethereum address, to 32 bytes. Okay. The The steps 1 and 2 need not be in this order. There is no causality here. However, looking at the maturity of the works, looks like the Werkel trace will happen first. So that hence this order. Step 3 is where the state expiry concept will kick in. We will expire the period 0 state, the state which is represented using Werkel-Patricia trie. And the nodes here will now maintain only the period 1 and period 2 states. We'll hard code a fixed period of expiry, saying that every year we will expire the states. So as I said, we store the state for the latest 2 periods and seek witnesses for transactions involving expired states. So this is the roadmap. So I previously shown that there were 2 paths. One is the weak statelessness, which is more or less guaranteed to happen, or which has no reasons to believe that it will happen. And there is state expiry, which is still being experimented upon. The Werkel tries, which is the replacement thought of for Werkel-Patricia tries, is forward compatible. It's compatible to both these paths. Yeah, that brings us to look into the components of state expiry. We have already hinted at Werkel tries. They are mainly a replacement for Hexagon Werkel-Patricia tries for efficient witness sizes. As I indicated there, the 18 MB of Merkle proofs can be compressed to 120 kilobytes. There already exists a pre-EIP. Lot of blogs and resources exist for Werkel tries, and I give one major documentation for that. And a proof of concept in Python has been built by Dankert Fest from Ethereum Foundation, and there is a talk video by him too. So in summary, what I'm saying is all technical gaps of Werkel tries have largely been resolved, and it's kind of expected to happen after the merge and the cleanup. Optimistically, let's say Q3 2022. And as I said previously, it's forward compatible to whatever path the statelessness takes. Another major component is the address space extension. As I said, state expiry brings in the notion that the contract or the EOA addresses needs to be associated with periods in which they were created or deployed. So one leading approach is to make the address itself period aware. That means you somehow encode the periods in the addresses. The leading approach proposed by Vitalik suggests that we extend from 20 bytes to 32 bytes the address space, so that the byte 0 captures the version. Bytes 1 and 2 is mainly 0. I think it's reserved for the sharding purposes. Bytes 3 to 5 encode the actual period number. Byte 6 to 32 will be the actual Ethereum address. Currently it's 20 bytes, but this is 26 bytes of Ethereum address. So this brings in the question that how can a new address, which has 32 bytes, interact with the old address, which is the 20 bytes. So we use the terminology long address for the 32-byte address and the short address for the legacy addresses. So suppose a long address contract calls a short address contracts function. Then we maintain a data structure called translation map, where when we jot down or we note down this long address, and we have a compressed unique pointer to this long address, which is a short address. And then when a short address interacts or communicates to a long address, we look up this translation map and use that compressed unique short address in a way to reach the long address. Now the question comes whether who stores the translation map? Where is this translation map stored? So there are multiple options. One is to store this entire translation map in the state, but this translation map is unbounded. It allows the state to grow in an unbounded fashion. The second option is to partially store this, store a part of the translation map in the state, especially for the addresses that are in the current and the previous period. And for the expired addresses, do not store in the state. And the other approach is to make it completely ephemeral. Do not store the translation map at all. You compute the translation addresses for a block, execute it, and then forget about it. So this is best in terms of the sizes, but it's worse in terms of execution time, because every time we are computing the translate addresses. So there are still a lot more questions in this space that are not addressed. The research is very active. I'm happy to take questions. You can answer as much as I can. So there is another approach for extending the addresses is called bridge contract. The thing is, do not allow the legacy contract and the modern addresses to interact directly. Let them go through a bridge contract, which mediates these conversions. So that's largely the idea. So that's mainly it from a presentation. In summary, what I'm saying is statelessness or state expiry work is critical for Ethereum to overcome the increasing burden of unbounded state growth and to maintain and increase decentralization. And some form of it is bound to happen. Some form of this work is bound to see the light of reality at some point in time. State expiry approach is the leading approach, which actually bounds the state size and retires the not so frequently used parts of the state. We discussed some questions that the state expiry throws in, and we overviewed some of the components of the state expiry, namely the virtual tries, total network, or address space extension. Research space is challenging. The design is not yet complete. So it's like good opportunity and ample scope for any researcher or a developer to come in and work in this large research/engineering space. It's exciting work, meaning that you get to research, you get to explore, you can draft specifications, you can develop prototypes, see the feasibility, propose specification can get adopted by the Ethereum community. So it's very exciting research involved. So I invite everyone to participate, and I'm happy to take any questions. Peter, you want to go through this?
Yeah, I can try and get my computer to work. There you go. Yeah, I can quickly go through and then we can do questions. So there is a huge roadmap of talks coming up. Yeah, good. Don't need to plan any talks for quite a while. So next week, so not 2 weeks' time, but just 1 week's time, we've got Pericles coming along, and he's going to tell us about data costs or costs of storing data in various places in Ethereum. So storage and the other places you can store data. So that should be a very interesting talk. Then on Tuesday, the following week, I'm actually doing my PhD thesis review seminar. And they said, look, you know, it's open to the public, anyone can come along. And so I thought, all right, I'll just put it on Meetup. Why not? So you can come along, try and understand what I did for my thesis, and then throw stones and ask me tricky questions. There's the week or the day after that, we've got Anthony coming along, and he's going to give us a talk on the MEV attacks and how to mitigate them with Hyperledger Besu. So that he's based in London, so that's going to be 5 p.m. Brisbane. A week and a bit after that, we've got the Symposium on Distributed Ledger Technology, so the SDLT. So this is not an Ethereum Engineering Group meetup event. This is actually a separate event, and I was going to put the link in. So it's an in-person, in Brisbane blockchain event. So it should only be, you know, I imagine of the order of $100 ticket price or something along those lines. So if you're interested, please, or just Google it and you'll find it. A bit after that, I'm going to do a talk on a recruitment test that I've used at Consensus, and just, I think, workshop actually getting through that recruitment test. And I know some people went through that test reasonably well, and other people found it extremely difficult and ended up not, so they might have known some Solidity facts, but they didn't know enough about blockchain and Solidity altogether to actually pass. We're going to have a networking and recruitment event at the end of December, and then there are some more events for next year. So there's full set of events. But why don't you stop sharing, and Raghavendra, and we can go to questions. So whilst people are thinking about the question, Raghavendra, you might want to look at the chat. So I asked a few questions in chat just so that I wouldn't forget to ask them later on.
Okay, so I think the block headers are stored, and there is also the transaction receipt for each transaction. When you search for transaction, you must be answering the question for the previous question, sir.
But starting at 12:57. So how long is the period expected to be?
Yes, period is expected to be a year, but that's not fixed yet. So it could change.
Wow, so Vitalik's really getting prepared if he's got 2 to the 24 years. That's a long time. Yeah, maybe they're thinking about making the period shorter at some point. Because if you've got 3 bytes, that's.
Yeah. So the question is interesting. Is the state expired on a per slot basis or a per contract basis? Yes, it's a per slot basis. You have contract state separately. The storage state is separate. It's per slot basis. But there is some ways to kind of rope in the adjacent slots when you are accessing a slot. So that is just there. I mean, if you are pulling one slot to the current period, I think, I'm not sure, you will pull the slots adjacent to it too, a limited number of slots. So, but it's not at the contract account granularity. It's
which makes sense, because some of these contracts have got megabytes or tens of megabytes of data. But so all right. So anyway, the approach will handle like some data and code. So the code's always going to be old, because you write the code once, and then after the first period has gone past, it's going to be historic. So the code after the first period is always going to be old.
So yeah, that brings us to one design question, saying that, do you consider read as a frequent access? If I'm reading data, if I consider that as a frequent, if I'll be frequently reading, then I should consider read also as write, in a way that you bring all the read data of the slots into the latest period. So there is still discussion on that. There's no conclusive decision on that yet. It is possible that whatever read data to be also brought into the current period. In that case, as I said, the contract code will also be most frequently accessed contract code will be sitting on the latest period. What is a non-membership witness? Yeah, so in Merkle trials, I don't know how to create a non-membership witness. You'll have to provide the entire tree, I think. But in terms of cryptographically, it's possible to construct non-membership witness, proving that, let's say you have vector of data or an array of data, let's say from 1 to 1024. Membership witness says that given a data element D and then index I, this data exists in this vector at the index I without knowing the entire vector. So that's what the membership witness is. But non-membership witness says you give a data D and a commitment to the vector V, And the non-membership witness says that this data does not exist in any of the indices. With the current scheme, I haven't gone into details of the Merkle tries. I think that's the plan for the next talk or the plan for the SDLT talk. Is the Merkle tries is using what is known as Pedersen commitment, and they use inner product arguments for opening. These are kind of loaded terms, but what it's saying is it is possible to construct membership and non-membership witnesses.
Thanks, that makes sense.
Yeah, so this question is, if I create an address in period N, then use it in period P, does the address change? No, the address won't change, as well as the period in which the address is associated with, that also will not change. Suppose, let's say I deploy a contract in period N. That address is associated with the period N. And I access this contract in a future period P. The address and the period that is associated with N comma, let's say address is A, N comma A remains the same. They come to the latest period. The key to address, so the key to access this account state still remains N comma A and is not associated with the P. But the account state resides in the period P. Anyway, all the period states are a key value store. You just need a key and a value to check whether that exists or not. So with N comma A, you check whether this account exists in the current period. You still maintain the period in which the account was created or deployed. Yes, you don't change addresses. Yeah, why are long addresses needed? Actually, it's not very critical. It's not very necessary to the idea of state expiry, but that's been one of the prominent approach proposed. Okay, so the intuition there is you need to associate addresses with the periods. Why not encode it in the address itself? So we have 20-byte addresses. We typically deal with 32 bytes in Ethereum. So why not expand the address to have 32 bytes and encode the period number inside it? But this is not a requirement. One can actually propose some other schemes as well. I think there was one proposal which is not a period-aware address scheme, but I don't know how far it went in.
Yeah, that whole address extension thing feels like it's going to impose a huge amount of complexity. Unless it's really, really needed, it'd be great not to do it. But anyway.
Yeah, that opens a scope for a simpler scheme. I think people haven't been able to come up with a simpler scheme. People still are chasing the complex and more complex schemes. But there's really a requirement we don't know. Case is still open. So can lookup of expired address go recursive? It's not recursive. There can be a chain in terms of nested contract addresses and storage slots, but it's not recursive, I would say. Will gas costs for storage operations change for expired states or current state? It will change because the validator or the block producer still needs to process the witness, but the extent to which the witness should be priced, I don't know. That's still being determined. Creating witnesses, processing witnesses. Yeah, any further questions? We are on top. Time-wise.
It looks like I think you might have answered them all. So, well done. Anyway, that was very interesting. And well, I've definitely learned something given I've got answers to my questions. And yeah, it's interesting. So the Merkle try seems locked in, and the rest of it, something's going to happen, but exactly what happens is an open question. Would that be a good summary?
Yes, that could be a good summary. Thanks for stating that.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to clear it up in my own mind, but yeah. All right, cool. Well, look, thank you very much, Raghavendra, and see everyone in, well, 1 week's time. for the talk on cost of data storage. All right.
Thanks, Peter, for hosting me, and thanks everyone for the questions and participation. Bye.
Right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Raghavendra.